Today's topic is autoethnography. It's part of APA's new book series, The Essentials of Qualitative Methods. Each book is a step-by-step guide on how to conduct a popular qualitative research method. We have published 6 books in the past 2 months, and another 6 books will be published this fall. To learn more about the series or to order the books, please visit our series page. Once again, we will put the link in the chat box. We have one more webinar coming up on April 30th, and you can find more information on the pages as well. So go ahead and check out our landing page. Next, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Chris Poulos, who's also the author of the book, The Essentials of Autoethnography. Dr. Poulos is professor and former chair of communication studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. His research focuses on autoethnographic and narrative inquiry, communication in personal relationships, stories, lies, and secrets, and many other topics. So let's welcome Dr. Poulos.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to share my screen here so you can see what we're talking about. Let's see if it works. There we go. Welcome. I'm joined in my office here today by my canine supervisors, Finley and Jackson, whose main job is to make sure I get my work done during this pandemic. I'm going to start, because I'm an autoethnographer, of course, I'm going to start with a little story. This is a story about how I got into this kind of work. As an autoethnographer, I kind of feel compelled to begin with a story. So I believe events conspired to make me an autoethnographer, or as one of my mentors, Bud Goodall, put it, you don't find ethnography, it finds you. First, you should know that prior to my doctoral program in communication studies, my background was in the humanities. My BA was in philosophy and film studies, and my MA was in religious studies. And my strengths were in writing, as I've been doing that as a daily practice since I began writing. I had a little help. My mom was a first grade reading teacher, so my brother and I were guinea pigs growing up, and we started reading and writing actually a little bit before first grade. So I was sort of in a daily practice of writing since I was a small child. So that was one of my strengths. But entering the PhD in communication studies, I was sort of blindsided by the preponderance of more social scientific studies I was reading that emphasized statistics, which I had never taken. One day I was expressing a little consternation to my advisor, and he reached onto his shelf and he handed me a book called Casing a Promised Land by H.L. Goodall Jr. The book was a narrative ethnography of an organizational culture written in the style of a detective novel. That we could do this was a revelation. I went back to my advisor. I said, "Can I do this?" He said, "Sure, take my class next term." My assignment in that class was to write a field ethnography. Remember, ethnography, the root of ethnography, writing about people, graphe ethnos, writing about people, at an interesting site. I was determined to find something unique, and I did. It happened that I worked out at an athletic club at a Jewish community center. No, I'm not Jewish, but they had a great workout facility near my house. I had noticed these older men, mostly in their 70s and 80s, going in and out of this sauna. And when they went in there, they were doing something rather unique. They were participating in an ancient ritual known as schwitzing. It's a ritual carried out in a super hot sauna involving a massage with a large soapy broom made out of palm leaves, followed by a dousing with buckets of very cold water. And then they would walk out of the sauna into the lounge that was in the locker room, in the men's locker room, and gamble and tell jokes and eat and spend most of their day going back and forth doing this sauna, this schwitzing thing. So I had my sight, but I quickly realized that my sense making of what turns out to be this ancient practice carried out in a super modern facility was missing something. I simply had to account for my own experience as an outsider on the inside of something unique. I was off and running. That was the 1990s, and narrative ethnography and autoethnography were just kind of bursting onto the scene in my discipline. So I got started. It was an exciting time to do research that was vastly different from the other methods and methodologies I was being taught in graduate school. And I apparently had a knack for it. So here we are, 26 years later, and I've been on this path for all that time. And here I am talking about a book, and we've done something here, I think, that not many people have done, which is write about how to do it. There are a lot of books on autoethnography, but they tend to not go through a step-by-step process. So I'm going to try to walk you through here sort of what we're going to do here this afternoon. I'm going to tell you what the agenda is, and then we're going to just kind of go through these things. So first I want to talk about the outline or flow of the book and a little bit about philosophical conceptions and foundations. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about rationales for doing autoethnography, some ideal uses, some key features and components of the method, some examples of research questions that I have picked up and used and others have pursued through autoethnography, the main components of the method, and I'll give you a little bit of exemplars to consider, some things to take away as we leave today. So the book is structured like this. We begin with some conceptual foundations and very quickly get into doing autoethnography, what some people might call data collection and data analysis. And then we get into the practice of writing and the daily practice of writing that most autoethnographers do. And then there's some emphasis on the process and the craft of building a good autoethnographic study and how to pull it forward into publication. And then a few variations. We'll talk a little bit about variations, various combinations of this method with others, and so on. And then it closes out. We close out the book with a section on integrity, methodological integrity, and ethics. So here we go. First, the conceptual foundations. I'm gonna just leave it on this page, but I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the background before we get into the rationale. So a little bit about the philosophical and conceptual foundations of autoethnography. It has historical roots in field ethnography. You may be familiar with early anthropological studies of other cultures where anthropologists traveled off to the South Sea Islands and observed cultures that were other than their own by immersing themselves and observing and chronicling and mostly writing what John Van Manen came to later call realist tales about what they were seeing, what they were observing in another culture. That sort of moved into sociology in the mid-20th century, early and mid-20th century, and into communication studies later in the 20th century. It also shares conceptual space with phenomenology and existentialist philosophy, this notion of writing from within an experience of observing and participating in everyday life, and then writing from within that experience is a key component of phenomenology and existentialism. So autoethnography is driven by acute observation of and participation in human social life. It also finds grounding conceptually and philosophically in social constructionist and symbolic interactionist philosophies, theories that were mostly put forward by sociologists early in the 20th century. Think of George Herbert Mead, Irving Goffman, and people like that. Along with dialogue theory and all of these sort of theoretical roots find their way into understanding human social life as constructed in and through everyday communication practices. And then finally, we look to narrative theory, which shows us the value of storytelling in human communication. As Walter Fisher famously claimed, maybe we're not Homo sapiens, the thinking creature, so much as we are Homo narrans, the storytelling creature. And if you think about, we are the ones who tell the stories, and stories sort of drive our everyday life and our everyday communication practices. So autoethnography is designed to tap into the resources of participation, observation, introspection, dialogue, and story to build a narrative line that evokes the lived realities of being human. So the rationale for doing it, I like to call it ethnography with a kick. Again, I talked a little bit about how ethnographers would go out into the field and try to study another culture and try to make sense of what they were observing and sometimes participating in, and then come back and report on that. Along the way, people started experimenting with other ways of rendering the experience of participant observation or observation of other cultures. Famously, Clifford Geertz visited Bali and was studying cockfighting, and he writes a piece called Notes on the Balinese Cockfight, in which he uses what he comes to call thick description to invoke and evoke what it was like to be an outsider looking in on the experience of villagers in Bali, which couldn't have been further from his own experience before that. What it's like to be a part of this practice of something that was so, for lack of a better word, foreign to him. And so there was this rationale for bringing the observer into participation mode, for honoring the subjectivity of the observer. Autoethnography positions the openly subjective voice, the embodied experience, the knowledge, the reflexivity, and the praxis of the researcher at the center of ethnographic work. Why? Because field ethnographers noticed that objectivity was not only difficult to impossible to achieve, it's also not all it's cracked up to be. It leaves something vital out of the story. So autoethnography is designed to evoke the richness, the layers, the nuances, the depths, and the mysteries of human social life from a position of knowing from within. And the Greeks knew about this. The ancient Greeks called this phronesis, this notion of practical moral knowing or knowledge building from within the experience of being a human being. And the notion of praxis not being really separated from theory. Praxis is action, performance, accomplishment. So we are, as humans, we are storytellers, we are theorizers, we are observers, we are participants, and it's particularly, autoethnography is particularly suited for coming to understand human social life from within the experience of being a human being. And the last thing is that the last rationale that's a little bit different from other approaches is that autoethnography uses writing directly as a primary method of inquiry. And this was sort of laid out by Laurel Richardson, who's a sociologist, as this notion of using writing to discover what is coming to be known and what you know from the experience of being the observer and the participant in human social life. So some ideals uses for the method. So people who've known me for a while would say, oh, that guy has a lot of questions. That's true. I have questions. And sometimes, maybe most of the time, these questions are about things that people don't like to talk about or write about. My research is largely focused on instances in which communication tends to fall apart. My field is communication studies. When things go sideways, when things blow up. And most often these moments come to me from as part of my own personal life experience within a family, within friendship groups, within work groups, within a community, within a nation. So these odd moments, these moments of interruption, these moments of disruption in everyday communicative life. And again, going back to social constructionism as a grounding philosophy, I consider communication to be the central praxis of human life. So that's my bias. So examples, I've written about trauma, loss, and grief. I've written about secrecy and stigma, about dreams and imagination, the mysteries of inner life. So if you think about these are disruptive experiences that create a need, maybe a drive for coming to understand what's going on and why we feel the way we feel, why we act the way we act, and so on. Mental illness, this widespread, incredibly widespread, difficult anxiety that for example, that we've all felt, and many people have felt, and many of our students, if you're a professor like I am, our students have felt during this pandemic, during the uncertainty of this strange time in our lives, during a period of time when not only were we dealing with a pandemic, but we were dealing with widespread social protest, and also an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States that went awry, but still awfully scary. So we've seen an uptick in mental illness issues on campus and around the world. And so maybe writing about it is a way to get at the sort of incredibly difficult, widespread anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. I had a similar moment in my writing about such things during the time after 9/11, when there was a widespread sense of anxiety in those first weeks after the 9/11 catastrophe. Abuse, addiction, dysfunction. If you know anything about 12-step recovery programs, you know that they are based in storytelling. And I'm not suggesting that anyone study anonymous 12-step programs, but to understand that storytelling as the basis of a way to overcome problems may be a key to coming to understand those problems. So writing from a personal standpoint about subjects like this might shed light, might bring insight, that sort of thing. Memory, which is oddly not, it's a huge part of our human experience, but also not always fully reliable. So I had a student in my undergraduate autoethnography class a few years ago who on the first day I'm going over the project, which is really to write a story, a life story about their experience from the time that they can remember, from their earliest memories forward. So, we're talking about 18 to 25-year-olds really in this class. And a hand goes up in the back of the class. And I call on this young woman and she says, "I don't know if I can take your class." And I said, "Really, why?" And she said, "Because I woke up on my 16th birthday and had no memory of anything that had happened before that." It turns out she had a swelling in her brain from a fever that created amnesia. She knew what things were in her environment, but she didn't know her parents. She didn't know her, she didn't have any memory of her life. It had all been wiped clean. And it just happened to coincide with her 16th birthday. And she said, "So I don't know if I can write about my earliest memories in the way you're talking about." I said, "Wow, you just started a great autoethnographic project there. Start there." And then things like conflict. When people stumble into conflict, what's going on? What's the experience of conflict really like? What emotions are people feeling? Why are we saying the words we are saying? Exploring these questions through writing can change the tenor of conflict. Some conflict mediation practitioners have people write narratives about their conflict experience. And I have discovered for myself that post-conflict reflection and writing can be really transformational. Another example is people's long-term experiences in a field. The mental health practitioner, the conflict mediator, the teacher, who has been in the field for, say, 25 or 30 years, how else are you going to get at the full depth of that experience than to have that person write some kind of a narrative? I'm thinking of a colleague of mine who is in the process of doing an edited book on just that topic, practitioners of conflict mediation. And he's soliciting autoethnographic narratives as the central part of that book, trying to get at the richness and the depth and the angles and the views of the experience from within being a practitioner in that field. And then finally, the taken for and granted and overlooked aspects of human social life. And I'll have a bit more to say about that in just a minute as we get into a couple of examples. So, key features and components of autoethnography. First is researcher reflexivity and systematic introspection. Reflexivity, reflection, participating in and observing in everyday life, writing notes about it to reflect, going back to the field, so to speak, whatever that might be, coming back to reflect, to engage in systematic introspection, to get at sort of all of the experience, as much of the experience as we possibly can, so that we can put that into an autoethnographic study. There's an emphasis on the craft and the quality of the writing. Autoethnographers tend to use the conventions of fiction writers because those are the best writers among us, and attempt to at least offer what Geertz called thick description of the scene, good dialogue, interesting sort of character and character development, even if the only character in the story is the author, him or herself. A sort of coming to know through the craft and the quality of the writing, components of time and space and plot and so on. And then finally, as I mentioned before, using the writing process itself as a primary method of inquiry. By this, I mean writing to come to know your subject better. And that'll make a little more sense in just a minute, I promise, when I talk about the sort of practice or the examples that I want to talk about on the next slide. Sorry, I lost my place here. So sample research questions. What on earth is going on around here? This can apply to anything. Or what is it like to experience X, whatever that is, an event, an encounter. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of an example. A few years back, maybe 15 years ago, I was beginning to teach a course on family communication at my university. And I started noticing students talking about secrets in their families. And it was fascinating to me. And I had a student come to me and tell me in my office a secret that her family had kept for many years that had just been revealed to her. And I started to get interested in this idea of family secrecy and family secrets. I was asking questions like, well, what are the kinds of secrets that people keep? And I started off by just making it an assignment in the class. I said, all right, go out on fall break, go out on spring break, whenever the class was being taught, and go home and see if you can find out a family secret that's been kept from you for all your life. And sure enough, most of them came back with one. It turns out most secrets are stories waiting to be told, and most families have someone willing to spill the beans. So there's been some very interesting secrets kept in these student families. So I started to think about my own family and realized that my own family also had this practice of keeping secrets or keeping things under wraps, so to speak. So I started getting interested in why people keep secrets. What communicative purposes do secrets serve? What does it feel like to be shut out from a story? How does secrecy shape communication and relationships? How does secrecy affect harmony and tension in families? And so I wrote a book about it called Accidental Ethnography, an inquiry into family secrecy. I did this because I had stumbled into something that I thought was really fascinating. And it turned out there weren't a lot of studies on family secrecy at the time. There wasn't a lot out there. And I thought, well, maybe I can fill a gap. I realized very quickly, as I mentioned way back when I was talking about schwitzing at the beginning of this talk, that I couldn't really tell the story without accounting for my own experience in my own family of what turned out to be quite a few secrets that were being kept and had been kept for a very long time in the family. And I kept asking why? Why are we doing this? What is going on here? What is going on? What on earth is going on here? All right, so to do autoethnography, the book goes into some depth on this, that the main components being the way we go about doing autoethnography begins with what I call attunement, what some autoethnographers call mindfulness, in the process and practice of participation in an observation of human life, including my own life, especially maybe my own life. Exploring, asking questions, going out like I was doing with my students and saying, hey, what secrets do you know? What secrets have you been told? What secrets can you discover? And so on. So I'm searching as an autoethnographer for stories, for more conversations, for artifacts. I'm going to pull out an artifact that I feature in my book. This is a baseball. I hope you can see it. This is a baseball from when I was a child. I played Little League Baseball, and all the way up through high school, I played baseball every summer. And this particular baseball was from a team that I was on when I was 13 years old. And the story of why this baseball is an important artifact is in the book. So that's a little teaser. If you want to read the story, you have to read the book. How's that? How's that for a deal? But it's an important artifact that's become to have some real rich meaning in my life. Not because I had it, but because my father had it. So we're mining memories, emotions, intuitions, intentions, and so on. And again, we're engaging in this notion of systematic introspection, this notion of looking at what are our emotional responses, what are our rational responses, what are our irrational responses, what are our storied responses to our experience of human life. Okay, so there's some really good work out there, some examples that I think really stand out. And this will give you a sense of why I think autoethnography finds it important to deal with issues that may not otherwise be dealt with. So Tony Adams has written a book called Narrating the Closet. It's about coming out as a young gay man in a very conservative family. He's telling it from his own point of view, but he's also engaging in the research and engaging in a conversation with the larger culture about what it's like to have to live in the closet and then come out of the closet. Robin Boylorn's Sweetwater, Black Women and Narratives of Resilience is another great example. It's an exemplar of how to write about a series of experiences that are unique. She grew up in a rural, very small rural town, a Black town in central North Carolina. And it's a very unique experience, but the way she writes about it and the story she tells and the conclusion she draws makes it come alive even for someone like me who grew up in urban environments and am clearly not a Black woman. Ron Pelias wrote a book called A Methodology of the Heart, which is about academic life. A more recent one, Blake Paxton's book, At Home with Grief, Continued Bonds with the Deceased. He's having conversations in this book with his mother who has passed away. And then again, I mentioned my book, Accidental Ethnography, An Inquiry into Family Secrecy. So we're coming up on close to time here for questions and answers, but I do want to give you a few takeaways to go home with. First, if you want to do this, you want to write every day as a process of discovery. So get started. Read every day, write every day. All good writers are readers. I started off reading, as I mentioned. My mother was a first grade reading teacher, and I got fascinated by great stories. So read every day, write every day, rewrite, edit, polish, rewrite. All good writing is really rewriting. Take a risk, write about your own experience, see where it takes you. And finally, this isn't a very big risk. You can buy and read this book, and it's at a good price, $19.99. I think I've hit my time now, and we're going to go, I believe, to questions and answers. Did I get that right?
Yep. Hi, everybody. I'm Emma, and I work for the American Psychological Association as our sales associate. And I'm going to do the Q&A today with Christopher. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. That was really thorough and engaging. We have a ton of questions which reflect such wonderful engagement. So one question that we have is, how is this method different than a memoir or autobiography? And how does focusing on your observations in this method differ?
So the first answer to that question is that genres are difficult to pin down. The lines between them are blurry. So we have autoethnography, memoir, autobiography, creative nonfiction, other forms of writing that invoke personal experience. The distinctive feature of autoethnography, and I probably should emphasize this more, is that it enters into a conversation with the critical and academic literature and the larger culture. So it's not just like if I write an autoethnography about my experience with my father, which happened to be a conflicted relationship, I'm also writing about conflict writ large and about conflict, particularly between fathers and sons in a specific generation. Similarly, I'm writing about family secrecy. I'm not just writing about my own family secrets or other family secrets, but about the larger conversation about communication in everyday life. And in that way, I'm invoking and drawing in the writings of other scholars. And you won't see that much in auto and memoir. You won't see them. You'll just see more. So there is a difference. There's not that intellectual conversation per se always going on in those other forms. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, that was really thorough. So another question we have is about how you address ethics. Does autoethnography need an ethical approval? And what should we state regarding ethical approvals if you wanted to get published in a journal or book or anything like that?
It's a good question. So this is interesting. The answer, I'll go back to my qualitative research professor whose answer to questions like this was always, it depends. If you are writing solely about yourself and your own experience, you are your own IRB. You don't have to give yourself or get approval to do that. That said, if you're writing about others or engaging others, your institution might want you to. So, but the question, of course, comes down to what are the standards at your particular institution? This is something I've been looking at for a long time. I was actually on a panel 21 years ago at a national conference when IRBs were just coming into being in our field, institutional review boards, and nobody knew what to do with them. And there were a lot of people arguing that we shouldn't have any even conversations with them. And other people were arguing we should join the board so they understand what we're doing. And back in those days, ethnography and autoethnography were largely exempt from institutional review. Things have changed and they're really all over the board. Every institution has slightly different rules. My own institution doesn't want to see it unless I'm going to do something nefarious with other people. They're just not interested. There's too many other things they have to do. So it depends. But there are, I will just say real quickly, there are books on the ethics of doing autoethnography, and there are a lot of good pieces on that. And I can give you references for those if people need those. So.
Quick question, another one. Do you have any tips for people trying to get published in this discipline, or whether it's in journals or books or anything like that?
Well, so there are a number of journals that really welcome this kind of work, and others will just be like, what is this? So I think the biggest thing I would say is find the places that do support it. There are a lot of interdisciplinary journals. So, for example, the Journal of Trauma and Loss, if you're writing about one of those two things, welcomes autoethnographic work. But I wouldn't write them anything that's not one of those two things. The Journal of Autoethnography, on the other hand, specializes solely in autoethnography, and it's a University of California press journal. It's a great journal, and you can probably get a foothold there. There are a variety of others: Qualitative Inquiry, International Review of Qualitative Research, Journal of Contemporary Ethnography. There's a whole list of venues where you can get journal articles published. And then there are now more publishers, book publishers, that will accept book proposals. For example, do you notice those exemplars are all from different presses, the ones on the previous slide that I showed. So there are a lot of venues for this work, and it's growing.
Another question we have is kind of, I guess, a distinction or a clarification. A couple people are wondering, are these references kind of focused on just the researcher themselves, or could a researcher study the experience of someone else using this method?
So, as I mentioned earlier, the genres are a little blurry. What you're describing would tend to be a kind of a mixture of autoethnography and other forms of ethnographic work. Some people put a slash in it, auto/ethnography, to show that it's both, and it's both about me and other people. And the answer is yes, people are doing that. There are a variety of variations on this method. Some people, people have done all kinds of studies, even focus group studies, where they write about their own experience of being the researcher, but also write about what the focus group is saying about the particular set of topics. So blending kind of the narrative autoethnographic parts with the other parts is happening more and more. So yes, you can do this.
Another question a lot of people are asking is there a specific time or like tips or tricks that you use to set aside time each day to write and research and kind of do this work?
Yeah, so I think most people need to find their own rhythm, their own space for doing this, but I think it's got to be important enough to you to set aside time to do it. So it's like exercising. If you don't set aside time to do that, you won't, right? So what I do, I have a fairly strict ritual, which is I write in the morning before I do anything else. When I was chair of my department, I decided that I wasn't going to die of administration. I wasn't going to just do that. So I spent at least 2 hours in the morning writing before I did any administrative stuff. I shut off email, I shut off all that stuff and just wrote. And I got into that practice, and I've stayed with that practice. Earlier, when I was doing my dissertation, which is a kind of phenomenological autoethnography, I had two small children in the house. There was one was just born and one was a 3-year-old. So the only time I could write was after they went to bed or really early in the morning. Kind of gave myself a sleep disorder, writing at 4 a.m. to get that done. So for a long time I was writing, I would turn on the coffee and go write, and then go get coffee and write some more. And actually, to be truthful, my writing gets better with a little more coffee. But
as does mine. So another question we have is a lot of people are interested to hear you speak on reflexivity. What do you think the difference is between reflexivity and reflection? How does one become more reflexive as a researcher?
So the one thing the phenomenologists talk about, sort of moving outward, moving inward, moving outward, moving inward, a sort of recursive loop of observing and participating and reflexive coming to understand what's been going on. So I guess maybe it's a little more focused. I don't really have a stark distinction between reflection and reflexivity. I do think introspection, or being self-aware and coming to understand that you're trying to see who you are in the scene as much as who the others are in the scene. So for example, when I was writing about family secrecy, I was really trying to really spend some time coming to understand whether I was participating in this and how and why, as well as other people doing that. So I'm sure there's some qualitative methods book that gives a definition of reflexivity that's better than that, but that's my working way of thinking about it.
Another question we have is, can you discuss a bit of the systematic part of systematic introspection?
Yeah, so the work of Carolyn Ellis, who was a sociologist but is now a communication scholar, and is one of the pioneers of autoethnography and communication studies, talks a lot about how to do that, what's systematic about it, and kind of follows a stepwise process of doing it. But so some of the practices that might occur, let me see if I was going to see if I could find it in here real quick. Okay, I wrote this book over a year ago, you know. Where is it in these 100 pages? Yeah, that's what I thought. There is a section on this. The short answer is you can read pages 28, 29, and 30, or 28 and 29 of the book, but so I think part of it, the core of it, is taking, just like we talked about with writing, is taking the time to do it, and then following through of like asking yourself the questions that are relevant to the experience or to what you're viewing or observing in the world. This notion of looking in and seeing what are my emotional responses is one part of that. What am I sensing through my senses? Like, what am I noticing through my 5 senses, and maybe even my 6th sense, which would be intuition, of intuitively knowing what's going on. There's a guy who talks about, John Schotter, who talks about this notion of phronesis, and the example he gives is, how do you know when you're in a romantic relationship when to utter and how to utter the words "I love you"? You know, if you get it wrong, right? you kind of know, oops, because the response is not what you wanted. But there's something about it where the timing and the declaration itself and the tone of the declaration itself is something that you know from having been a participant observer in everyday life and within this particular relationship. So there's a sort of systematic part of it that's almost unconscious that we're tapping into. So we're getting into that intuition. We're getting into, okay, is there a way to separate? This is what the phenomenologists call bracketing. Can I separate myself out from the experience and look at it from the outside, from a bigger picture point of view? Can I see if there are any, my understanding here is this, but are there any variations that make more sense? Can I change the way I see it and have it make more sense? And so on. I feel like that was a half answer, but it was long, so.
Unfortunately, we are out of time.
Wow.
Thank you so much for all of your wonderful Q&As and your presentation, Christopher. We really appreciate it. So for all of you out there still listening, please do sign up for our last webinar for the spring season. And thank you guys for joining us today. Christopher mentioned so many wonderful things that if you want to get into more details or see how this research could apply to the work you are doing, please do buy the book. This code offers you a discount on our website. And we really appreciate, your research and your feedback on our work. So we're going to send you a survey. And if there's anything else, we'll be in touch.
And if you're persistent, you can find me. If you have questions for me, I'll answer your questions.
There are some questions left
Emails.
over, Christopher, that we might send to you and hope our
Okay.
participants can get
Okay.
back to them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.